Hello everyone. Wish you all a very good evening. Thank you for joining us today for this media roundtable on the urgency for adaptation in India. We've all had about 2 weeks now to sink our teeth into the IPCC Working Group 2 report on adaptation and digest its contents. I think it's come as little surprise that the report was yet another warning on the rapidly rising risks of climate change and the growing costs associated with it. For India, the report held several dire warnings on heat and humidity, extreme weather, impacts on food production, impending sea level rise, to name just a few. And while the IPCC has repeatedly laid out the case to prioritize adaptation, last year's adaptation gap report gave damning testimony of the little progress we've made thus far in funding and implementing adaptation measures. The costs of adaptation could go up to 300 billion per year within the decade, the report says, only to multiply further in the coming decades. Currently, we devote a mere fraction of the climate finance towards adaptation. And in this roundtable, we'll be looking at what adaptation means for India and what the country needs to do to confront the challenge of devising and financing adaptation pathways. We have with us Professor Dr. Chandni Singh, who's a senior researcher at the Indian Institute of Human Settlements and a lead author of the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report. Professor Raman Sukumar from the Center for Ecological Studies at IISc and a former contributor to the IPCC. Dr. Ruchika Singh, the Director of Sustainable Landscapes and Restoration Program at the World Resource Institute, who is a little late and will be joining us in sometime in the middle of the session. Professor Purnamita Dasgupta, Chair in Environmental Economics and the Head of Environmental and Resource Economics Unit at the Institute for Economic Growth. She has also been a lead author of the IPCC in the past. And finally, Dr. Ashish Chaturvedi, who's the Head of Environment, Energy and Resilience at UNDP India. Thank you all for joining us. This roundtable has been scheduled for 1.5 hours. The first half will be for our panel to share their perspectives on the adaptation challenge in India. And second half will be reserved for the question and answer session. We encourage everyone to put in your questions in the chat box or to send them either to me or Gunjan, and we'll get to them during the question and answer session. So as most of you must be aware by now, this session is being recorded. Without taking up any more time, I'd like to call Dr. Chandni to come and actually share with us what the Working Group 2 report actually contains, what messages it holds for India, particularly when it comes to India's rapid rate of urbanization, as well as the expanding coastal settlements that the country is currently seeing. So Dr. Chandni, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for organizing this, I guess. It's really nice to see this continued interest in the report. And of course, also to add that there's a next report coming out in April on mitigation. This one focuses really on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. I'll do a quick overview of the key things that the report says, but I will focus not so much on impacts and vulnerability, but talk about adaptation today. I was a lead author in the regional chapter for Asia, chapter 10, as well as a cross-chapter paper on coastal cities. And I'm happy to take questions on these topics later. All right, so to start, sorry, just take a minute for the slide to change. All right, so maybe while that's happening, yeah. So just to give people, I'm sure many of the viewers are already aware of this, but just to give people a sense of the breadth of this report, it's 3,600 pages, which I know is a lot, but it covers the range of findings that we have on impacts, adaptation and vulnerability. There are sectoral and regional chapters, and then 3 synthesis chapters at the end of the report. It brings together 270 authors, both coordinating and lead authors. And we really assess a large pool of literature, as we know very well from the assessment report 5 to now, the literature on adaptation and impacts has really expanded. So you can see that large number of 34,000 papers being assessed for this report. And also to add that these reports go through several rounds of inputs from both the scientific community as well as governments. And that's what you see at the bottom of the screen. Around 62,500 review comments are gone, and each one of them have to be addressed by the authors. And I'd also just like to highlight across the report, we have 13 authors, both coordinating lead authors and lead authors from India, which is compared to the other Asian countries, quite an overrepresentation. So I would say that at least Indian expertise is being recognized within the IPCC. Now coming to the big key finding, I think at least is summarized in the summary for policymakers, which is a shorter document aimed at the policy audience. And this is what it really says, that the scientific evidence is unequivocal. Climate change is a threat both to human well-being and the health of the planet, which means human and natural systems. And then it makes this call for urgency, really. So it says that any further delay in action will miss this brief and rapidly closing window that we have. So this window of opportunity to adapt. And of course, this report distinguishes itself, I feel, from other earlier assessment reports by really focusing on the solution space. So how do we bring adaptation and development together? And I think this is really key for a country like India, and important for us to recognize that the report does focus on that. So I'm not going to go into details into this complex figure. It's the first figure you come across when you look at the summary for policymakers. On the left, I think the idea is that this is where we are currently. So we are in the red, so to speak. This is what last year in August, the Working Group 1 report really showed us, that we're already seeing a lot of climate change induced risks and impacts. And these are leading to losses and damages in human systems, but also ecosystems facing limits to adaptation and losses and damages there as well. So this is the current situation we find ourselves in. And then if we move to the right side, we see this is the kind of future climate change that we want to move towards, where we are able to adapt and mitigate, where all our ecosystems are able to transition in a way that they are healthy and they are supporting and providing all the services that they currently do, as well as transforming and transitioning our human systems, which are all the things that are written here: energy systems, industry, urban, rural, livelihoods and settlements, and also critical infrastructure. So this is just the idea that both human and natural systems are coupled, and we can't really make changes in one without impacts on the other. One of the key things, this is the only slide I have on risks and impacts, because I feel that they have received a lot of media attention, and there's not been a lot of attention on the solution space. So this is my only slide on risks and impacts. For me, this is one of the key takeaways of the report, that gone are the days when we were seeing single hazards occurring in particular places. We are now seeing simultaneous impacts taking place, and they occur simultaneously, which causes compound risks. So just a layering of risk in a particular place or for a particular sector. And also the other thing that we really highlight is that when we see risks and impacts, while they occur in one place and occur perhaps for a certain group of people or certain natural system, they can cascade both across locations and across sectors. So what I mean by that is that what happens in our coastal cities does not remain there, or whatever food insecurity because of changing rainfall patterns that we see in rural areas also then transfer to urban areas, because our food systems are so interconnected. So it's important to understand that, because this is the problem space, and that problem space has changed a lot since past reports that have come out. And so we need to understand that we need to first of all adapt to multiple risks happening simultaneously, and the fact that they can jump sectors and jump locations. So our adaptation strategies really have to be fit to this. Now, when we look at as I said, we assessed so many papers, and we tried to understand what really is happening in the adaptation space, how our countries, how our continents really adapting. And we find overall that there's been there's very strong evidence to show that adaptation action has increased, especially around planning, little less on implementation, but adaptation action overall has increased. There is evidence of that. But the problem that we see is that this progress is uneven. By that, I mean certain places are adapting more than others, and that's linked to the kind of finance that goes into adaptation, the kind of capacities that are there in certain places. Secondly, most of the adaptation is happening very sectorally. So you'll have the agriculture sector having particular strategies, or perhaps certain cities having strategies in a particular sector. And they're also very risk focused. So they focus perhaps on adaptation to flood or adaptation to a cyclone, but not looking at the multi-hazard aspect of risk. And of course, this is something that is a red thread throughout the report, which is that we are not adapting fast enough. The element of urgency is still not seen in adaptation action. The other big thing that the report, and these are just the global findings, and I can talk about some Indian examples in the Q&A later, but these are just broad brush findings from the report on a whole. There is also evidence that there is an increasing gap between current adaptation action, what is happening, and actually what is needed for the changing risk regime that Working Group 1 showed us last year. And of course, these gaps are not equally felt by everyone. Lower income populations, existing marginalized communities are facing these impacts more than others. So there is also the need for targeted action and targeted closing of the adaptation gap. Now, this is where I want to spend slightly more time. This is a figure that you'll see in the SPM, it's figure 4. Underlying this huge assessment are around 1,300 peer-reviewed journal articles, where we really, for the first time, tried to assess what are the range of adaptation strategies that exist and are feasible. By feasible, I mean like they are possible, that today in present day, we can actually implement them. And then based on the literature we pulled out and based on actually earlier reports like the special report on 1.5 degrees, also the assessment report 5, we pull out a range of 23 adaptation options, which you see in this column 3, where I've put my cursor right now. So these adaptation options, we assessed how feasible they are, and this is the next column. So what really the takeaway from this is that presently, based on the kind of technology, the institutions we have, just the finance we have, these are certain options that are already possible for governments, for people to actually implement. And I would also like to bring to your attention that we have this framing of system transitions on the extreme left. This really tries to break away from that sectoral approach where we say that we have to adapt in water, have to adapt in agriculture, while those are very important. As the 1.5 report really clearly showed us that we don't have the luxury of adaptation sectorally. And so we need to think of systems and how, as I mentioned in the earlier slides, these coupled systems of human and ecosystems. So I will just give some examples. If you look at this particular section, these are adaptation strategies that are linked to rural areas. And here, while overall feasibility is medium to low, what we see when you go to the other parts of this figure, what this figure really does is where are the barriers to this feasibility? Why is the feasibility medium to low? And here we see these different dimensions of feasibility. Underlying this are hundreds of papers really trying to assess that perhaps where you see a small dot, there are in the case of, let's see, efficient livestock systems. So improving grazeland management strategies, for example, for people who are pastoralists, if you want to take that as an example, there are significant institutional and in some cases technological barriers that reduce the feasibility of this option. Or if you take the example of improved cropland management, this is things like all those strategies that even India has, zero budget natural farming. The feasibility of it is we assess it as high economically, but then medium on several other indicators because there may be less social acceptance. There may be the institutions are still not, they are still posing barriers to this adaptation option and so on. So I just wanted to give this as an example to be able to read this figure. Similarly, in urban systems, we have medium feasibility across several of these options. I'll take the example of green infrastructure, which is what is being called ecosystem-based adaptation in cities. We have a lot of Indian cities actually, and just yesterday or day before, Mumbai also putting out a big focus on urban greening and planting trees for cooling our cities, for flood management and things like that. So here also we see there is high feasibility across several, if you look at the dimensions of feasibility, across several dimensions, but there's low feasibility when it comes to institutional capacities to actually deliver this. Moving on, I'd just like to say the next panel of this very complex figure tries to then capture what are the maladaptive, potentially maladaptive outcomes of those same adaptation options. So are they building ecosystems and their services? Are they prioritizing particularly marginalized ethnic groups? Do they lead to gender equity or inequity? And then finally, what are the outcomes for low-income groups? So this, all of these together actually talk of this idea of climate justice or injustice. Like, is the adaptation option leading to equitable outcomes or not? And then, because we all know that countries are working towards the sustainable development goals, a country like India, where development priorities are often more pressing than our climate goals in some ways, although now we know that too is changing. But we also do a mapping of these adaptation options with sustainable development goals. And we show that some of them have very positive impacts for several SDGs. Some of them have negative impacts. And then for some, we just don't know what there is. So those are those gaps that you see. So overall, just the key takeaway, I guess, from this assessment really is to show that there are several adaptation options that are feasible. They have synergies with SDGs. And I didn't also just mention in the last slide, we also do an assessment of synergies with mitigation, because we know that climate finance is also competing with mitigation, adaptation finance, there is only a set pot of money. So I think we show that there are these triple wins between adaptation, mitigation, and the SDGs. Okay, I'm not going to go into too many details of this. Let me just skip these. I realize, I think time-wise, these are just examples. The second big thing, apart from adaptation feasibility, that the report talks about is maladaptation, which are the unintended negative consequences of adaptation. These often are things like for the first time, I think we do a full assessment of maladaptation in the report. And this is only because now the evidence, although maladaptation as a concept was discussed in AR5, many people actually asked this question about, is this something new? And I don't think it is. But what is new about it is that now we have a lot of empirical or real world examples on maladaptation that we could then assess in the report. So a classic example I think many people have been hearing about is building hard infrastructure. So things like seawalls and dams and dikes to sort of protect coastal areas from coastal flooding as well as sea level rise. And while in the short term, they can reduce risk, they can always, they do tend to have negative consequences for marine ecosystems, for mangroves around that particular area. And then also if sea levels rise to a certain degree that were not planned for when the seawalls were built, they can also lead to risk reduction. And just because these are hard structures that are already put into place, there can be, you kind of lock yourself into a system, and that can have unintended consequences going into the future. The third big thing on adaptation that the report talks about is that there are limits to adapting. Not everyone can adapt, first of all, and that there are hard and soft limits to adaptation. So here I want to just take one example of extreme heat in India. I think we have very clear numbers on how heat is going to be impacting our cities and our rural areas, actually. And I feel the cities have got a lot more attention, but it's equally a problem in rural areas across India, especially for agricultural laborers, for example. We know that extreme heat and especially wet bulb temperatures, which measure heat and humidity together, are going to become more significant. Now, there are hard limits. For example, a wet bulb temperature of 35 degrees is a hard limit beyond which humans cannot survive. That's an example of a hard limit. But a soft limit is the idea that although there are adaptation strategies, they are not available to everyone. And that in the future, adaptation options can open up that aren't even there presently. So again, an example of a soft limit to extreme heat would be that certain people are able to adapt. Whether that's positive or negative is an open question, but like by having cooling devices in their houses. But certain populations, maybe construction laborers, people who are living in informal settlements, who don't have maybe access to green spaces around their houses, they will face limits much faster. Also, there's this focus in the report on, of course, we need to adapt. We know that there are losses and damages already occurring. They are going to increase at higher warming levels. So there is this very clear call for adaptation. But equally important is this call for making rapid, deep cuts in our greenhouse gas emissions. And that's the story of mitigation. And we cannot really, I think that's what we try to highlight, is that we can't think about adaptation alone. And we also have to think of mitigation. The report, of course, doesn't go into it in great detail, but that will be there in Working Group 3. And to bring all these things together, so adaptation, development, and mitigation, this idea of climate resilient development is used. Again, it's not new. It was spoken about in the 1.5 report, but it's been detailed, I guess, with examples and more literature since then. So what is climate resilient development? It focuses on reducing climate risks, which is adaptation, mitigation, which is reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and then making changes both in our natural and our human systems. So enhancing biodiversity on one side, and for human systems and equity and development considerations, really trying to meet the sustainable development goals. And when all these things are brought together, that is what is considered climate resilient development. So if you look at the graphic on the right side, it's moving from a highly unequal, vulnerable world where there is high global warming and high risk to a world that is that sees more human well-being, lower poverty, and then lower global warming, and of course, lower risk overall. And this is just the stylized figure, which is the last figure in the SPM really, that tries to talk about these pathways that you can take to reach these higher levels and lower levels. We, of course, understand that this is a global assessment. There are no countries mapped onto this, but I can imagine this kind of stylized figure being used for particular countries to see where they are, where they've come from. Of course, for India, it's very crucial to also recognize that India is has not been a large emitter in the past, and we still have a lot of development priorities. We have a lot of infrastructure to be built. So we have to have the space to pursue our own vision of climate resilient development without, undermining our development needs as well. The only thing, I guess, that is really key out here is that already at current warming levels, climate resilient development is difficult as it is, because there's so many competing priorities, and also just the risks are changing so much. And there's very clear evidence to show at higher levels of warming, even 1.5, but going beyond, it's going to become increasingly difficult to move up towards these green pathways. And we will end up tumbling towards this redder bottom half pathways. All right, I'll stop there. I know this was a whirlwind presentation, but happy to answer questions as and when they come. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. That was very interesting and helpful. Particularly, I think the examples on maladaptation are further evidence that actually something is happening. This whole process is iterative and incremental to a certain extent. So we have to learn best practices as well as what works where. The other interesting thing was in the feasibility, which in my opinion would go some ways in helping governments devise their own adaptation pathways. One of the places where the feasibility was highest was in the terrestrial and land-based adaptation possibilities. And that's where I want to bring Professor Sukumar into the discussion and ask him pretty much about what the role of India as a tropical country with quite a high percentage of forests. And I wanted to know where you see the role of forests in the whole adaptation scenario, particularly with forests mainly being looked at as a store of carbon from a carbon removal perspective whenever we speak of expanding forest cover or tree cover. So yeah, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. As I'm traveling in the Northeast with limited internet connection, please excuse me if I kept my video off during this discussion. It's almost a cliche to state that India's geography, climate, forests, and indeed its people are extremely diverse. But I shall begin with this cliche. Because this brings a lot of challenges when we come to the issue of how do we conserve forests, how do we use our forests for adaptation. I mean, not only to provide the enormous resource needs of people, but also, in the whole matter of adapting to climate change. Given the fact that our forests suffer from a very high degree of fragmentation, this is obviously something historical because India has been populated, for centuries or millennia, and most of our forests are not pristine. Almost all our forests are, eventually grown from as a past history of use, of utilization, and therefore most of India's forests are really secondary forests of some sort or the other. At the same time, a very large proportion of our population depends on forests for a variety of products. These, of course, include timber products, which has come down now because of the almost close to cessation of logging, formal logging in most states in the country. But a very large proportion of our population still depend on forest for a variety of biomass products, food fiber, and so on and so forth. This is all something that you know very well, and therefore I should not dwell more upon this. Therefore, it's extremely critical for us, as Mitesh said, that we should look upon a forest not just as a storehouse of carbon, but also as a resource to provide the needs of the resource needs of our very large population. Especially in the coming decades, when the main challenges will be there, and our populations will still continue to use forests for extraction of resources. Well, the latest state of forest assessment by the Forest Survey of India came up with a figure of 21.7% of our land area under forest and 2.9% under tree cover. Now, I know there have been controversies about this report, but I shall not get into those details, because what I want to dwell upon is not exactly what percentage of our land surface is under forest cover, but how do we go about trying to achieve the goals of climate adaptation, in the forest sector. Very broadly, what's the kind of process that we need to follow? Well, the FSI further, in the last couple of assessment reports, they have come up. They have given up the kind of the positive news that India's forests continue to sequester carbon. So I think the previous report gave a figure of 0.3 tons of carbon per hectare per year. I think the recent report is actually enhanced that somewhat, maybe 0.4 or 0.5 tons. I've not got into the details of that, but I think this kind of matches very well with long-term research that my group has been doing in the Western Ghats. Of course, it's at one site in the Nilgiris, but here we have shown that over the past 3 decades plus, that in spite of disturbances, in spite of the world having undergone over the last 30 years, I'm sure a certain degree of warming. There have been major fires that have taken place in this area. There have been major droughts that have hit these forests and so on. In spite of that, the carbon sequestration has actually been very strong in a conserved forest, in a forest which is a national park and a sanctuary. And these are tropical dry forests. So a very large proportion of our forests are actually, tropical dry or moist deciduous forests. And there is evidence that they seem to be much more resilient to, ongoing climate change. Again, the jury is, not out, still too early to give a firm answer to, the question of how resilient our forests are. But very recently, there's very good evidence coming from tropical wet forests or the tropical rainforests, places like Amazon. Amazon, for instance, in the last 10 years or so, has shown declining carbon sink potential, and it seems to have almost hit, very close to zero presently. And there are fears that the Amazon rainforest might flip into something like a very tropical dry forest or a savanna. That's what some of the models are showing. At the same time, there's also evidence that the second largest stretch of forest globally, which is the Congo Basin in Central Africa, has had declining carbon sink potential over the last few decades. It remains to be seen because countrywide assessment has not been done over the past 30-40 years in India, but at least the data seems to show that carbon sink potential is still there. But that by itself does not necessarily answer our, the question of how do we adapt in the forest sector. India has a large number of schemes for increasing the forest cover. Many decades ago, we set ourselves a goal of bringing 33% of our land under forest cover. And however, we must remember that only about 15 to 20% of the land is under government control. And that means if we have to achieve 33% forest cover, the remaining land that has to either come under tree cover or forest cover or remain under that forest cover, if the forest is already there, as in many parts of the Northeast, has to come from community-owned, the community-managed land or privately owned lands. Okay, so that's very, very important. And therefore, any adaptation measures that we try to implement, has to have people's participation, community participation, or the participation of private landowners. This is essential. Now, India has a large number of schemes and a huge bank of money in the form of CAMPA, the Compensatory Afforestation Program, which has at one time it had a corpus of 40,000 crores, and it is now being used across many states to further the agenda of increasing the tree cover, forest cover, whatever you may call it. We also have the Green India Mission, and I'm not very sure how much progress that has made, but it's pertinent for us at this stage to ask a few questions, especially in the context of the need for to conserve our both plant and animal species. When we talk about forest, I won't talk about forest in isolation. It's plant species, it's animal species. Given the rate of change, given the nature of change of temperature, as well as spatially, geographically explicit changes in rainfall patterns in the coming decades, we need to recognize that plant and animal species will have to move. They have to migrate in order to adapt. That's the only way that we are going to be able to maintain our rich biodiversity. Climate migration is extremely an adaptation. I mean, what I mean is plant adaptation, plant migration or animal migration, in the context of climate change, in order to adapt, is extremely challenging under a scenario of high degree of fragmentation of our forest areas or other natural areas. Therefore, we need to quickly move into a planning mode of what I call a sustainable landscapes. People have spoken earlier about sustainable landscapes, but this has become all the more important in the context of climate adaptation in the forest sector. Our landscapes are very, very complex mosaics, of national parks, sanctuaries, reserve forests, agricultural land, coffee estates, tea estates, and so on and so forth. And unless we are able to maintain the integrity of landscapes in some form or the other for plant and animal species to migrate, adaptation is not going to happen. So on the one hand, you're going to, with increasing temperature, plant and animal species are going to move or migrate to areas which have more suitable temperature, which means cooler temperatures. And that would mean, along an altitudinal gradient, the plant and animal species will move upward, in the Himalaya or in the Western Ghats. And we already have evidence that plant and animal species are migrating upward in the Himalayan region. Now, I would like to, we should ask three pertinent questions. And one first thing is, what to plant? What are the species that we should plant? In the past, there have been a lot of blunders in the way we have gone about forestry. One is that we have taken species from one part of the country and replanted them in other parts of the country without giving any thought to whether those species are adapted or not. For instance, very, very large scale introduction of teak or Tectona grandis from the south to the north of the country. At the same time, we have planted a lot of exotics over the decades, Australian acacia wattles, which has now become an invasive species in the Western Ghats, eucalyptus, which has depleted the groundwater, and so on and so forth. Any number of examples, and many of these are also become invasive plants. So the first question we need to really get our hands on is what to plant, what species to plant. So of course, easy to say just plant native species, but it's also very important to understand principles of ecology, of how different species are co-adapted, benefit from each other mutually, in a coexistence mode, when they are planted together, in what proportion do you plant them, how do you plant them, how do you space them, and so on. We are very, very far away from any kind of understanding of what I could call restoration ecology or restoration of our forests. So the first question is what to plant. The second is where to plant. I think this is very, very important. When I say where to plant, I would bring up two issues in this. The first is that most of our plantation drives are essentially distributing money, to different forest divisions, to different rangers, and tell them, set them a target, okay, you go and plant so many 100 hectares or 1,000 hectares or 10 hectares or whatever. This is the money, go and plant it. That's an extremely random way of planting it without any planning, to move towards the broader goal of sustainable, attaining sustainable landscapes. So geographically, it's extremely important for us to decide, where exactly do you promote planting? What kind of species do you promote in terms of planting? Can we do anticipatory planting when we know that plant species are going to migrate from lower elevation to higher elevations and so on? So here is where the concept of landscape scale planning becomes very important. And the second aspect is that of, when you say where do you plant, you only plant on government lands, or do you also plant on private lands and community-owned lands? And it's very obvious that you have to plant on private lands and community-owned lands. And that will only happen if you incentivize the whole issue of forestry. Today, we actually punish people. So I'm kind of bringing in the legal, also we need to look at a legal framework for forest protection, which actually penalizes people for keeping their land under forest cover, because then there is a very high chance that this will be called a deemed forest, under existing laws, and then lock you into, without any further use of that land or any further development or any economic incentive whatsoever. So there is a very strong disincentive today for people to maintain their lands, private lands and community lands under forest cover. It's a very, very big challenge, and which we need to address, by changing the legal framework for this. When we look at the working group 2 report, Dr. Chandani has done a very nice job of summarizing all the broad issues that that have been raised in the report. But the issues of equity, climate justice, and indigenous knowledge systems comes out very, very strongly. In the SPM, especially almost every section and almost every paragraph, makes references to equity, social justice, and indigenous knowledge. And I think it's very important for us to recognize that, when we talk about people's participation, the participation of our most marginalized communities, that includes the tribal population. If you look at the FSI report, you will find that the average forest cover of India is 21.7%. But in the tribal dominated districts, it's 37.5%. Very, very significant. Therefore, tribals are not necessarily destroying forests. They're actually, living in areas where the forest cover is much greater. So it's very important to make them partners in on our forest adaptation and plantation. I'll just flag one particular issue, then namely that of wildfires. The last few years I've seen, huge wildfires in countries like Australia and north of the Arctic Circle, in Siberia, in California and Canada, Western Canada, and so on and so forth. And of course, fires are also very important, in our Indian forests also, although our contribution of emissions from forest fires is much lower than the global average, and it's mentioned here. But here's where there's increasing recognition that indigenous knowledge of controlling forest fires or managing the land to reduce the risk of fires globally, in Australia and Africa and so on, and even in North America, that we had a sea change during the colonial period where fire suppression was the favored policy of trying to keep out forest fires, which is not something that is going to work in an era of climate change, where we are going to get higher temperatures, and therefore forests will be at much greater risk of fires, much greater fires because of fuel buildup and so on and so forth. So here is where I think indigenous knowledge systems, which have been, and wisdom which has been practiced over the centuries, that needs recognition and respect, and we need to learn from that. So here, what I would just conclude by saying that we need a lot of planning ahead in trying to move towards sustainable landscapes. For the broad biodiversity conservation, in terms of wildlife conservation is an area that I am much more involved with, and this means that we need to promote the forest adaptation agenda very, very strongly through incentives and with people's participation. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. Those are very valuable insights, particularly on the challenge of trying to plan for migration that's already underway and choosing a better path than we have so far. I would imagine that funds like CAMPA and their relevance to how well we can adapt are only going to increase with time as we go on. At this point, I'd like to kind of pivot a little bit towards the finance side of things. It's almost a cliche, again, to kind of say that finance is not moving towards adaptation and most of it moves towards mitigation because there is some scope for economic gains to come out of it directly. And on the other hand, specialized finance for adaptation has been a long-standing demand for many developing countries at the international negotiations on climate change and climate action. So I'd like to bring in Professor Purnamita Dasgupta at this point to kind of speak about how far we can lean on this demand for adaptation finance. How do we go about separating adaptation to a level where we can actually assess the needs for adaptation finance and then place a demand on it? What are the pressures for diversifying this finance, and are there any pathways that are kind of available for us to look at?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I feel privileged to be part of this roundtable, so thank you for inviting me. I will just speak and not use slides because I see this as an opportunity to actually share thoughts and talk about this very important dimension of finance. I may need to switch my video off in between if there's any kind of disruption in the bandwidth. So apologies in advance if I need to do that. So finance, I'd start, my takeoff point is that from the IPCC working group to report, which states that finance is a very important dimension of the how of climate risk management. So it becomes an enabler of the utmost importance. Now, given that we all wish to take the science on the impacts and the vulnerabilities that climate change will create for developing countries in general and for India in particular, it becomes almost an imperative that, okay, so you have to adapt, therefore. And then the question becomes, so you have to get the finances in place, all your enablers, including finance in place. Because obviously no one wants to think about a world where you plan in a way that you are unable to meet the adaptation challenge. Because the science is also telling us that even if you manage to limit your warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, you would still have a substantial amount of adaptation to do. On the other hand, the science is also telling us that the current adaptation that we are managing is incremental, including in India, and we still have a long way to go to get to that transformational stage. What is therefore becoming more and more important is that, and relevant, as you very rightly flagged in the beginning, is that two parallel conversations now have become equally important. So I would say from a discussion of adaptation finance, which was pitched mostly earlier in terms of a global dialogue, in terms of acknowledging that the amount of finance on the table for adaptation is most inadequate to meet the financial needs of developing countries alone. So if you consider that we are far from reaching 100 billion finance commitment in general for climate finance, come to the fact that the IPCC Working Group 2 report itself maps that most current estimates of the need for adaptation finance go well above $100 billion for developing countries itself for adaptation alone. So those are the sorts of magnitudes we are dealing with here in terms of the flows of finance that would be required. Consequently, given the sorts of negotiations that we have seen at the recent COP and what is currently on the table at least, it means that that other parallel conversation now really needs to pick up. And that's the one we have to equally start being prepared to run with, which is the conversation on internal finance. Right? So I'm saying that, you know, that shift in focus is, I think, something that willy-nilly is being imposed on developing countries in general, and India is no exception to that rule. So that's the first part I would like to flag. The second thought I would like to flag in this regard is that, you know, resources and capabilities are unevenly distributed, not just globally, but also within the country. And here again, there are parallel arguments. On one hand, you need North-South partnerships to deliver on climate finance if you really wish to embed climate action in development. But on the other hand, we also parallelly need our financial institutions to do their bit, okay, to come into the climate finance space, to start looking at what can bring returns on their portfolios, which, while engaging with climate finance, how they can help, you know, leverage private finance and do that leveraging act, where public sector finance institutions can play a major role, how we can design things more efficiently. So parallel conversations, which I think I'm very hopeful about, because you see them picking up, but there's still quite a bit of way to go, obviously. So the third point I would like to come to, therefore, is a point on capacities. Now, often in climate finance discussions, we don't hear this talk about capacities. And I would really like to, you know, flag some of these connects. So even for climate finance, we need strategy, we need operationalization, and we need some execution. So I'll give you an example. So one is the whole story of financial institutions, multilateral, bilateral, and within the country, all levels of financial institutions, how we can improve that. The second is, how do we actually connect with stakeholders across the spectrum in this sector? So for example, you know, now in the adaptation space, you have some really headlines kinds of initiatives. So, but often these are, for instance, done by leaving aside the public sector, which of course has its schemes, programs, and budgeted allocations. So you could have a Mahindra Hariyali program, or you could have Hindustan Unilever coming with their water program, right? Which are great initiatives which connect across on adaptation programs. You see them, large companies sort of launching these, backing them up with resources as much as they can. But remember, a large part of the stakeholders who will be impacted, as well as those who will become vulnerable, are those who need to engage much more with the finance side as well. Now, whether this will happen through more fintech, whether this will happen because we will get our act together with small investors, we don't know as yet. But these are new things that we need to start thinking about. And, you know, some very encouraging dimensions are there in this IPCC reports, chapter 17, where they talk about the solution space. And, you know, what the kind of questions, however, which I think we're still missing answers to in spite of the large literature on the table, which will actually help stakeholders, you know, get more engaged with the climate space, is questions like, you know, so what's the business side of things? What's in this for MSMEs? There are many young, bright entrepreneurs who want to run with the green story, who want to do things in that space. Now, what is the kind of regulatory environment, for instance, that we have? One is about the pool of finance available, the access to that finance. The other is the regulatory environment, the compliance environment, the incentive structure for helping our MSMEs to come up, so that everybody starts getting engaged with the climate finance story. You see, so that's the kind of, I think, shift in discussions and dialogues we need at one level, while not at all giving up on the international space. And I must say that, you know, I along with many other researchers and scholars whom I know at least, were very disappointed with the kinds of outcomes on adaptation finance that one heard at the last COP. And the hope is that the next COP will help put this part of the story and the narrative together. You know, it's just something that we need, because I do not see the internal finance story picking up and running, irrespective of no matter how many papers you've read and how much literature you've accessed, and how many successful models of internal climate finance doing its bit in the developed world that you hold up. I don't see the developing world being just able to do so. They cannot replicate it without adequate external climate finance. It's just not possible. And I'm so happy to see again that actually this report does talk about it. It talks about the pathetically low levels of private finance in the adaptation space. It talks about the huge gaps between adaptation costs, finance for meeting adaptation costs, and what is on the table, and the ever widening gap between these. So I think that, you know, but to turn the camera inward, to turn the focus inward, that lens, we need huge support from the external lens. There has to be this confidence and trust building that goes into it. And everybody will strategize, every stakeholder will strategize in this space. And, you know, within the realm of financial institutions, we have to start placing the financial institutions as key catalysts. This is my understanding that, you know, the dialogue has to move more and more towards the role that financial institutions at both international and national levels can play to act as catalysts, because they are uniquely placed to engage across the stakeholder spectrum. I'll just wind up with one thought on, you know, I don't want it going down necessarily as a criticism, but it's not a criticism as such, but it is something that, you know, I really think deeply about, and I want to, and I don't know the way forward, but I understand that it's not easy, having been an IPCC CLA in the past and a lead author on the 1.5 degrees report myself. But I understand that you know, the literature has moved forward, and there are others around here, authors who are engaged with the current report. But, you know, one of the things that bothers me is three things, sorry. The first is, in discussions on the solution space, which this report, as the first panelist, Dr. Singh, very eloquently put, that there is an emphasis on the solution space. When I look at climate finance, I find that there's a lot of good takeaways and sort of learnings in terms of how to access climate finance, how to improve its effectiveness, and so on. What I miss still, or maybe it was there and I didn't get it quite, is what is the solution space for enhancing the available pool? The report, does a great job of tracking, highlighting, and upholding the gaps, right, in financing, internally, externally, and so on. But what's the solution space for enhancing these gaps? It would be great to see more of it. Secondly, how do you enhance the way in which the grounded realities, where climate and non-climate factors is intersecting, right? They make the decisions on financing that much more difficult, that much more tougher. Whereas we are all committed to understanding the importance of climate, integrating the climate aspect. But the fact is that how do you bring into this process of, because the IPCC reports are the gold standard. How do you bring in more of the grounded realities around finance from the developing world? This, I just don't see this process evolving within the IPCC. Perhaps this is not a fair forum to raise this question. I don't know. But so, for example, it would be great to see much more on catalyzing conditions, windows of opportunities, which are specifically relevant to developing countries. Is this just a literature gap where report after report, we just flag it as a literature gap and let it go? Is there some kind of follow-up actions that can be taken? Are there consortia that can be put together to put their heads to this and come up with those articulations in the appropriate forum, which can then be taken over by subsequent IPCC reports? And really, they give you a handle on saying, yes, hey, this is a great example of something we can pick up and run with. Thank you. I'll stop there and happy to discuss more on any particular aspect.
Thank you so much, Professor Dasgupta. That was very helpful. And ultimately, it will be a question of how well we are able to customize these pathways and also the finances that come towards these pathways for any geography, any society. And I would like to invite Dr. Ashish Chaturvedi to kind of delve on this a little deeper. What that would mean in the Indian context, customizing an adaptation pathway, plus maybe also a little bit on the finance bit, particularly in the in the current budget speech, there was this provision for a new climate action fund that was spoken about. Is this something that can be leveraged? How do you see domestic sources being leveraged, particularly as the government has emphasized that they're using only Indian public funds so far for any adaptation activity?
Thanks. Thanks very much for inviting me. And I've been sort of hearing quite intently over the last hour. So I would not like to repeat a lot of the things which have already been said, but move on to very specific things, sort of to move on to maybe practice and policy and a little bit away from science, I would say. I think one of the first points, and a lot of the sort of previous speakers have mentioned this, there is this entire continuum of development and adaptation, right? So all those who've been sort of working on adaptation for the longest period of time, we've actually had this constant struggle when it comes to finance of additionality in the context of adaptation. What does it really mean? And I think we need to have an India-specific answer to that, or a developing country-specific answer to that. Of course, in GCF board meetings, of course, this is very heavily discussed. But I think it would be good to actually have a developing country perspective on this. And it's not as if that this has not been discussed. There have not been suggestions in the past, but I think even based on the science which has just emerged from this report, you can come out with very pragmatic things which can be done on the ground. So one of the things that we've kind of, and I've been thinking about for the longest period of time, is how does one use climate information or climate science to advise policymakers or development practitioners at different levels of governance. So let's imagine that you actually have to use some kind of climate science or climate information, indigenous knowledge, which Professor Sukumar mentioned. If you have to do planning at the village panchayat level, how do you incorporate that kind of information at the village panchayat level when it is doing some planning exercises? And there are very creative ways, and I've been doing this since 2011, where you use some amount of climate information data, historical data, look at some kind of models which give you broad-based sort of projections about the future. Also look at sort of the felt vulnerabilities of communities, and how do you incorporate all of that into the planning process at the local level, at the village level, at the panchayat level? How can we do this systematically? So if you want to do it at the village level, if you want to do it at the district level, if you want to do it at the state level, and then of course, the national level, you have some kind of assessments available already. So I think what we need is basically institutions, and this is very closely related to development finance at different levels as well. How would you orient development finance if you're not incorporating climate information in your decision making? So how would you say that my sort of work on developmental practices is climate informed? And if it is climate informed, then it should lead to some kind of adaptation actions as well. So I think the critical element here is how are we mainstreaming the use of climate information when we start thinking about allocations of development finance, and at what all tiers of governance is it happening? So I think one sort of very simple thing that I've been thinking about, and I think at UNDP as well as with sort of other organizations that I've worked in the past, we really thought about very simple structures of making climate information available to local communities, and of course taking climate information from local communities as well, blending the science as well as the local knowledge to somehow come up with sort of information which can then guide the planning processes. But this has to be systematized within the government systems. The second part is, of course, we also need very simplified vulnerability assessments, which can be understood by policymakers as well as by sort of communities. And so that, of course, the science has to be localized, the science has to be understood by sort of communities at large as well, and also the policymakers. Because if you really want to say that we want to mainstream sort of climate information and climate science, which is, I believe, the sort of only way of kind of making a distinction, or not really a distinction, but also informing your developmental finance with and make it sort of amenable to adaptation. I think you will have to sort of find ways and pathways to incorporate climate information at different levels of governance. So that's my one large point. And that's very crucial because in the absence of that, of course, the developmental gains will be overturned. So you will sort of go back several years in time if you say that, okay, we continue to, and of course you will be maladapting, you're doing all kinds of suboptimal things and inefficient things if you're not really incorporating climate information. And therefore, I think the structure is very important. And I think there are simple and hard ways of doing it. And as far as I understand it, we're really following the hardest way of doing this. We're really trying to incorporate very high levels of science into this entire process to say that, okay, and trying to incorporate that into local planning processes, which is going to be very challenging. And I think we have eminent scientists on the panel, and I'm sure they can also sort of weigh in on this point. The second point is, of course, about sort of domestic finance. No? And the reason why I'm saying these 2 points are related to each other is if you really want to look at public finance, and 97% of adaptation sort of globally, I think, is public finance, is coming from public sources. Then what criteria do you use to say that we will reorient, or we'll sort of channelize some of this public finance for adaptation work? You can create funds, right? But those would be small. The kind of budget that an agricultural ministry would have, if you create an adaptation fund, it would completely pale in comparison, right? So I don't think specialized funds are going to do the trick for a country of the size of India. We have the National Adaptation Fund on climate change. We have had 30 projects, around 850, 900 crores in sort of well, lessons are still pouring in, but I think the kind of needs we have are not going to be filled by specialized funds unless you do this creatively, right? So what is that 850 crore being used for?
We lost you there for a little bit, Dr. Chaturvedi. Maybe
de-risking facilities with that 8. Maybe, can you hear me now?
Yeah, now it's better.
All right. Yeah, so what I was saying was that, yeah, it depends on how you use the specialized funds to unlock much more capital. So for instance, if you're saying that this 850 crores could be used to blend sort of grants with debt, loans. So a 25 crore grant could easily be carrying a 250 crore project in different parts of the country. And this suddenly changes the dynamic of a project. Now, a 300 crore project to a state government is way more interesting than a 25.
We've lost you again. Maybe it's better
if I switch off my camera.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So basically a deal in the 900 crores. The final part, the point that I would like to make is about sort of, and inspired by sort of this IPCC report, the kind of sectoral, sort of moving away from sectoral approaches to think about ecosystems. I think we need to develop some kind of flagship initiatives. It's a flavor of the day. We have to sort of, I think it's really good to start thinking about big initiatives. I remember at the time of the UNCCD, there was some talk about doing some kind of a great green wall. Of course, that hasn't materialized yet, but I think we need to really do one flagship initiative, in at least a minimum of one flagship initiative in each of these different ecosystems that Chandni was presenting in one of her sort of slides. In the urban ecosystems, in sort of land and forest, and sort of different sectors, we need to do at least one flagship initiative and put in substantive domestic resources and say that, okay, this approach can potentially unlock a lot more resources, maybe coming from international sources, but also giving confidence to domestic sort of financiers, also public finance, people who are sitting on public finance, including actors like NABARD, to start funding these kinds of initiatives. Because this is how bankers will also think, right? So they will really need some kind of a model which can then be kind of unlocked or sort of be used in different locations, can be kind of scaled up in different locations. So I think we need those. So the first is this: we need sort of better channels of climate information. Second, about sort of looking at different models. So if you want to trigger transformative or catalyze transformative climate finance, and then really do demonstrations at scale, which can then be carried forward by domestic financiers, but also can be pitched to international financiers when they come calling. And it's not as if they're calling very often. So it would be good to be prepared. So that's it from me.
Thank you so much. That was great and had a lot of information. Would have loved to continue this. It's been a very rich and fruitful conversation, but we are above the time stipulated for this part. So I'll hand it over to my colleague and Director of Climate Trends to kind of guide the question and answer session. And of course, I do ask all the attendees to contribute with any questions that they may have for any of the panelists. So thank you all. And
thanks, Srishan, and good evening, everybody. My name is Aarti and I represent Climate Trends. My earphone goes off once in a while, so if you stop hearing me, please just do let me know and I will switch into speaking to my laptop. And We have about 15 minutes. I heard a lot of what you all said. Sorry, I could not hear Chandni's comments as I joined late. But I only wanted to give some context, especially because when we, as Climate Trends and Carbon Copy, organize these webinars, our intention is also to not operate in vacuum and try and connect what's happening in the external world to what's happening in the climate world. And there is a lot of interconnection that's at the moment, either because of the conflict in Europe. There is a discussion of what is opportunistic energy planning versus. There is also the fact that the IPCC working group has indeed shown that half of humanity is in danger, but emissions are highest ever and all of that. Everything that you all have spoken about speaks to risks that exist and that question on how much to focus on clean energy, decarbonization, electrification at the moment, developing cities through climate resilient development, and at the same time looking at also what adaptation would mean. And one of the concerns that came out from Working Group 2 conversations was essentially also about conflating adaptation and mitigation, and especially when money will be limited, and 100 billions is not where we would be looking at for adaptation finance. But when we came out of the COP26, the 100 billion ask remained. There was also the issue of dealing with loss and damage, and there was a to actually calling for 50% of 100 billion to be allocated for adaptation. Long and short, it just looks like the current conflict situation is going to lead to a lot of backsliding on certain issues, especially to the extent of symbolism and international fora when it comes to climate finance, the conflation of adaptation and mitigation finance. Do you see this as important? And is it all right if I can pose this question to the floor, and any one of you could pick up and respond? And if you think that this is not something to pay attention to, and what needs to be put in attention is mostly the kind of things that we discussed on transformative climate finance and putting demonstrations at scale and doing the good stuff in country domestically, and money will flow, then we'll take the conversation forward. But given the international nature of climate negotiations so far, the international nature of the climate narrative and debate, so to say, I at least wanted to pose that question on what it means in terms of the changing global situation and the conflation of mitigation and adaptation finance as such. Sorry if I was unclear. I just meant that each of the panelists should feel free to respond to this.
Okay. Should I come in on it? Since
Please, Professor. Yes.
Since I did speak
Yes.
about finance. No, yes, of course, you raise a very important question. And I think I can well understand if there is a slightly cynical view right now doing the rounds, because, it links not only with the current conflict, but it can also link with, as I said, this thing with the past, with what has happened in this pandemic phase that the world has lived through, right? So if you consider that, this conflict, this sort of mixing up of the climatic and the non-climatic factors, both in internal, within country, national and subnational levels of decision making, as well as at the international level happens. That's a reality. But I guess, we can still, let me elaborate a little bit on that. So for example, during the COVID phase, when there was all this dialogue going around on vaccine equity, you see, it was a lived experience that different countries were placed very differently. right? So of course, one respects the fact that technical know-how or resources, capacities, capabilities, financial will be concentrated in certain parts of the world. And there will be certain parts of the world which will not be able to run at the same pace. But when it is a global concern, a common concern, it's spreading across countries in unmapped and unprecedented ways. You see, what the world is looking forward to is integration in terms of vaccine equity, right? And in the way that you distribute it. So there are lessons that the world learns from there. What happened, what didn't happen, to what extent you did see some integration happening. You did see how far, for instance, was the WHO effective. It was very effective in communicating risk reduction strategies, for instance. So the risk communication was pretty good. But I don't know if all countries can say that they were equally satisfied with the way the vaccine deployment worked out, right? So there are learnings between these completely non-climate related events, or let me not say not non-climate related also, but between these sorts of events which call for immediate attention, immediate allocation of finance. And now you have the conflict post-pandemic, which will again call for its own demands on resources, right? So I think for me, it's perfectly within the spectrum of expectations that at least in the near term, there may be sufficient reason to believe that you may not see the kind of promises one would like to see actually work out. Yes, that's my take. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor, and makes sense. I mean, I think the vaccine apartheid did teach us that if that is how the world will act in a humanitarian crisis, then climate crisis, which is multi-decadal and happens over a long period of time, might not have a more aggressive or a collaborative response. And we saw a lot of conversation around solidarity and the lack of it on the vaccine inequity debate globally. And just the examples are not good, but like you said, those are lessons to be learned. I also just wanted to check, because some of you spoke about how specialized funds not do the trick, will have all these development projects in the end, some adaptation is inexpensive. It's kind of included in what development policies should be across local levels. But
It's
I think, sorry, we're losing your audio.
Sorry, yeah, your audio is not very clear.
Sorry about that. I was saying that, you know, on the one hand, we have very big conversations about international climate finance. On the other side, we are saying that specialized funds will not do the trick. But in the middle, we don't have any good institution or governance system in the country. The vertical links between center and states, the horizontal links across between the states, to be able to then address that if adaptation finance is not some magic bullet that will come from the West, and it is going to be various shapes and forms of development finance, how is that going to be in a systematic and an organized way? I saw Chandni has opened a video as well. So please feel free, Dr. Chaturvedi and Dr. Chandni Singh, to come in.
Chandni, you want to go first? I've said my bit in this, but yeah, sort of, I think what I meant was a specialized fund, for instance, in the shape of a national adaptation fund of the size of 800 crore, 900 crores is not going to do the trick. That was sort of the point that I wanted to make. And if you have to create specialized funds, you have to curate them well, right? So you have to really start thinking about how you can unlock much more capital with the kind of seed funding that you have. But I think the larger story is where sort of I'd like to really say, look at sort of development finance and how do you kind of channelize it. And there, it's you can do it in an ad hoc manner, right? So you can actually say, well, this is, and then again, of course, it'll be a big story that sort of, well, all our developmental funding, well, sort of on water is adaptation. All our developmental funding on smart cities is adaptation. I think this is not a story that is going to carry. So you need to have a system, you need to have a structure in place. And how do you evolve a structure like that? You need to, of course, acknowledge that is climate information is, and I think this is why I want to kind of harp on this point over and over again, because you need palatable climate information to inform financial allocations. And you can do it in very pragmatic ways. It's not as if that we don't have the experience. You of course have an aspirational district program. You have the SDG indicators. I'm sure there's a indicator which has been developed by the Department of Science and Technology, a vulnerability index. Now people might have problems with those, right? But the point is, can we actually come to a shared understanding of a vulnerability index at a district level and at a sub-district level? Can we actually start thinking, and it will not be perfect. And that's what I'm trying to emphasize, that the science is not advanced enough to really give us those numbers at the granularity of a village. And I hope the scientists confirm it. But the point is that you can then start thinking about, okay, the vulnerability in this district or in this group of villages is being driven by water availability, and it is affecting livestock. You can actually go to that extent. You have, like, for instance, NABARD has a credit-linked plan for every district in this country. How do they come up with that credit link? What is the demand for credit in a district? No? They actually have that. So what informs that offtake of credit at the district level? Are we using climate information to think about what crops are being given credit? What livestock varieties are being given credit? So I think we have to go to that level. And then we can come up with really then orient developmental finance into adaptation and label it and say, well, this is how much our allocation to adaptation finance is. And I think some of it is already happening. It's not, I don't think it's rocket science, but I think we need a shared understanding of it.
Yeah,
Sorry. Yes, please.
I heard Professor Kumar also unmuted, but Prof, is it okay if I allow Chandni to come in first?
Sure, please.
Yes, I just wanted to add to that. I am not a climate finance expert, but I really agree, first of all, that the IPCC report this report in particular actually let us down on adaptation finance. It does talk about the finance gap, but then, as Dr. Purnamita was very nicely saying, what do we do now if you want to move? If we are claiming that we're moving to the solution space, how do you enable increased finance for adaptation in particular? The numbers that we have in the report are that 92% of global finance goes into mitigation and only 8% into adaptation. So how do you start moving that towards adaptation A? And then generally, how do you increase climate finance, both domestically and internationally? So I feel that the literature wasn't there, but also I think the science, we don't need scientists to be doing this. We need economists, we need policymakers and practitioners actually to start answering these questions, just like Dr. Chaturvedi was saying. I just wanted to add one element which he touched on, I think, a bit, which is that finance. So we talk of several enablers to move towards climate resilient development. So finance, of course, is one of them. It is the most critical one in my eyes. But also governance and just institutions that are fit for purpose. I think that's one that we talk a lot about in very vague terms, like we need like governance barriers. We often talk of that in very vague terms. But for me, I think what that means is we don't have the problem of climate denial in our government systems, is what I understand. When you, which I think is a great privilege, actually, the lived experience of Indians across all our states and just all the places, we do experience climate variability, increasing climate impacts on a daily basis. So I think there is that kind of climate denial when you speak to government officers is not there. But what I tend to, when we speak to policymakers, the biggest gap is this, again, this aspect of bringing in climate information for decision-making, but not just decision-making in the short term. But first of all, decision-making in the long term and decision-making that's flexible. As I spoke earlier, right, our risk regime is changing so much that you can't be making short-term decisions for current risks and impacts. It has to be long-term, and it has to recognize that your plans will have to change. That kind of flexibility, I don't think we have in our governance and institutions. So it's a capacity building thing as well. Of course, you need finance for that, but we are really not thinking of that. And like, what are institutions? Are they fit for this? and really decision making under deep uncertainty. So that to me is another critical gap that kind of gets sidelined, but needs to be also focused on.
Fair enough. We are also on top of the hour. I'll let Professor Sukumar mostly wrap up with his comments.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I understand very little about finance, but I just earlier I had mentioned that if you take the Campa funds, like some years ago, we had a corpus of 40,000 crores, okay, a substantial amount of money. And that's like a war chest that we have with us for adaptation in the forest sector. If the entire Campa funding financing is actually oriented towards adaptation in the forest sector, it can do a lot of good in principle. This really means addressing the various issues that I had brought up during my discussion, about landscape scale planning, what to plant, where to plant, who's to plant, and so on and so forth. I'll just give I'll just wrap up in 30 seconds with a simple example. I'm in Assam, and I'm the what I call the Kaziranga landscape. And annually you have floods of the Brahmaputra, which brings most of the animals out of Kaziranga. You have elephants and rhinos and tigers and name whatever name, they all come out, and they all move to higher ground in the Karbi Anglong district. Now, Karbi Anglong is an autonomous district. It has its own council and so on, and it's got a certain amount of forest cover, other forms of land use, and so on and so forth. And for years or even decades, what I've been doing is that you need to put your money not just Hello.
Sorry, is it me,
Yeah.
Gunjan? Can you say?
We're losing Prashant.
No, I think we lost. I think the Zoom. I think it timed out, but just come back now.
Sorry, please go on, Prof. I think we can hear you now.
Right. Yeah. Sure. So what I've been saying is that we have invested a lot in Kaziranga in terms of protection of the park and so on and so forth. But we need to invest equally in the Karbi Anglong communities, so that they maintain a land use pattern, which is receptive to having wildlife or migrations of other species that come during the monsoon into the Karbi Anglong district. Therefore, it's not that from what I can't go into aspects of governance and how you spend the money and so on and so forth. But essentially, when we have a 40,000 crore war chest in the forest sector, the entire amount can essentially, I'm thinking long term, can be channeled into adaptation, effective adaptation using a sustainable landscapes approach. Thank you.
Thanks, Prof. I think that's a very clear-cut point, well made, at a point when there is less finance available, no government or even at the center or the state will have money to give out of pocket, then you do have all of these Campa funds lying that can be effectively utilized if there is the right political leadership, the right institutional framework, and just making sure that the resources that we have are utilized in the right way. I think there were a lot of good, insightful perspectives that were shared. We are a little bit over. I don't want to recap a lot of them, but mostly, the point that was made that we must do decision making for the long term and not in the short termism or with uncertainty. I think that's not just for India. As a matter of fact, with the way the conflict situation is and everybody's just hoarding cheap oil and fertilizer, it definitely shows that right now it's a very evolving situation. Maybe it will net out in a couple of weeks or months, who knows. But in any case, there are some discussions which anyway will remain relevant to the Indian development story, whether we call it adaptation finance, whether we call it climate finance. But I think what you all essentially made the point was that there is significant progress that is being made. Not all is bad. There are some good bits as well. And Mostly, I think it's also a time, however, I would say, where it's not just about action by one country versus another, but we do need a system change, especially with the way Working Group 2 spoke about things. And if that was a lost opportunity on adaptation finance, Working Group 3 is going to come out very soon in early April as well, and will stress a lot again about mitigation, fast, rapid, accelerated mitigation to countries where adaptation will remain central and fundamental. I think we will keep coming back to these conversations, but sorry for the rush. We don't want to hold everybody more than the time. Thanks to all the panelists for sparing time to join us late in the evening. And many thanks to all the attendees and participants for listening through and attending till now. Have a nice evening, and we will wrap this up now. Thank you.